If you've experienced anxiety, emotional pain, or self-sabotage, it can often feel like you're just managing the symptoms, just trying to get through another day with the weight of everything you're experiencing. But what if there's a way to get to the root of what's creating this experience in your life? And that is why I'm so honored to have Susanna Sweeney on the podcast today. With over 30 years of experience, Susanna Sweeney is a sought-after therapist, resilience coach, and trainer who empowers ambitious professionals to overcome deep-rooted blocks and unlock their true potential. At the heart of her work is her proprietary REPAIRenting method, a cutting-edge approach that guides clients through a transformational process that helps repair faulty childhood programming quickly, gently, and effectively, and permanently, resulting in freedom from anxiety, emotional pain, and self-sabotage. This was such an amazing conversation with Susanna, and I'm so grateful for everything she shared, from her personal journey to now helping others overcome some of the most challenging circumstances in their emotional and mental well-being. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed my conversation with Susanna. All right, welcome back to another episode of Rewiring Health. I'm so honored to be joined by Susanna Sweeney. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Kelly. Delighted.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm so much looking forward to this conversation because, what you do very much align with me, and I think it'll really benefit the people that listen to this. But before we get into some of those things, can you just talk about your story and what brought you to helping the people that you do today?
So really, we have to start quite young. And I grew up in East Germany, actually. So behind the Berlin Wall. I'm from Berlin. And there were parts of my childhood where I really saw the wall every day. And so when you grow up in a society like that, there's going to be a lot of traumatic and difficult stuff naturally. And it reflects in families as well. And so I would have been anxious from a very young age. So both due to family dynamics, but I also, when I moved into my teenage years, I realized we were trapped in this place. Like there was no way out, with the exception of a couple of Eastern Bloc countries. But it became more and more restricted throughout my teenage years. So in my mind, it became this big obsession that we were trapped. And it was really through my own struggles with anxiety and with emotional pain that I started working with a therapist when after the wall came down. Psychotherapy wasn't really a thing in East Germany. It was very much frowned upon. The state ideology was one of a collective idea. We're all in this together. We're building this better society. And so, these emotional problems exist in the West, but they don't exist here. We're all disciplined working machines. And so naturally, that was very much frowned upon. The individual struggles were, and towards the latter years, through the church, the Protestant Lutheran Church, it offered a kind of a basin for a lot of the opposition forces to collect inside. And there was also psychotherapy offered through the church. So at a very young age, I was able to avail of that. I just heard, you had to hear it on the grapevine, who to contact and where to go. It wasn't in the papers or anything like that. And that was my first introduction to counseling. It was really counseling, and it was very basic at the time. I mean, these were people who didn't have the advantage of any in-depth training. But for me at that age, it made all the difference. And I went from there, really. And then in my early 20s, started working with trauma clients in a volunteering role initially. I was already here in Ireland, and I got involved with building up an organization, a rape crisis center that was supporting initially women and then later on male survivors as well in the aftermath of sexual assault. Then I started training on the job. And so I suppose you could argue my work experience was very tough, maybe hardcore from the very beginning. I felt drawn to that. And it also provided me with some really deep insight into what works and what doesn't work, right? So more and more in the transitioning from the very early 90s to the mid 90s, more and more clients were coming with actually the want to change their lives, where beforehand it was very clearly advocacy and maybe just being a witness to their story. Maybe they hadn't told anyone before. By the mid and late 90s, especially, we were then in the territory where people wanted a long-term service. They wanted to change how they were in the world. And that's when I realized, I suppose about 5 years into my career, that talking was very limited. So naturally, talking is how we connect as humans. It's useful as a connection tool. It's useful to have a witness. It's useful to be believed with your story. Those are all great things. But when it comes to really making changes to how you feel about yourself, how you feel about your life, how you feel about the world, talking is very limited in what it can offer. And I suppose that insight brought me on a very long journey of looking for different ways of working. And so for about 25 years, I took an American training actually back then, which the Sensory Motor Institute is based in Boulder, Colorado. They offered a training that was available in Ireland, and I jumped on that because it was a very cutting edge trauma focus. And I just knew this was the right way to go rather than a generic psychotherapy training. I trained with them for 2 years in trauma and developmental trauma. It was very, very useful. And so in that type of psychotherapy, while you're still using talk, naturally you're using talk all the time, but you're in a different role, you're already facilitating a process. You're not just talking to people about any old thing, but your aim is to bring them through a change process and work with, at the time, the idea was that the trauma is stored in the body. Of course, we know the brain is the control center. Nowadays, you wouldn't really talk about trauma being stored in the body anymore. It's the brain. But you can work through the body and you can affect changes. And so that's how I got into this work. And so the last few years, I've been working with psychosensory tools. So very much. So psychosensory means we're affecting the psyche through the senses. So through the sense of touch, through the eyes, eye movement. So there's various approaches in that realm. EMDR is the most notable one that's known in the psychotherapy world. That's a psychosensory tool. I'm trained in EMDR. All the tapping techniques are in that pool, all the EFT, the TFT, and what have you. There's a vast array of those. And then working through touch. So havening techniques is one of my favorite go-to tools, and that's something I train other professionals in as well, mostly in Germany, actually, at the moment. So other psychotherapists, sometimes doctors, midwives. And so it's useful really for any realm where you want to do change work with clients. Psychosensory work, I believe, is the way of the future. We can work in affect very profound changes in a short space of time and in a really gentle way. And yeah, so that's my 25-year learning journey in a snapshot. That's where I've come from. And I suppose I just really found myself in therapy work. I find it very meaningful. I think there are very few other things that I would find meaningful. So I don't know. Sometimes, some people believe you're born to do something. I'm beginning to wonder that about myself. Was I born to do this work? Because I love it so much.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing your journey and the path that you've taken in the course of, learning and exploring things about yourself and then going on to helping other people. And I think it's like we're best served to help the past version of ourselves. And it's like the things that we go through, we end up learning from experience and then can help other people in those situations. So I think it's beautiful to hear your journey of going through some of the things that you went through and then going on to helping other people in those realms. And as far as talking about the differences between like talk therapy, traditional talk therapy, and then the psychosensory, can you talk about some of those differences? And because I think that, I have seen more of like a trend going towards that, but like I think there's still a big emphasis on just straight talk therapy. Can you talk about some of the things that, of course, are good about talk therapy, but also maybe some of the things that's lacking in being able to help
Yeah,
people through trauma?
sure. So, like, one of the great strengths of talk therapy is to talk about meaning. So you're making sense. You're making sense of yourself, of maybe the symptoms that you have, of anxiety or low esteem or whatever it may be you're struggling with. And you can put a narrative together. You can sort of conclude where this came from, why you are the way you are. And that's great. You can use talk to build a connection with a therapist. I already talked about that. And so when we're thinking about attachment theory, so attachment theory it's a stream, I suppose, in psychology that has certain views about where these emotional wounds come from, things like anxiety, low esteem, and so on. And attachment, those, I go into that a little bit more, but just for the moment, just to say that, of course, in terms of attachment to other humans, the therapeutic relationship can be very healing when it's done right. So that's another thing you can do very usefully with talk therapy is you can, by believing the other, by not judging them, you can build a deep connection with them. So those things are all wonderful. One trend that I see that I'm a little sad about because I think it's really very limiting. But somehow in the last few years, it's really crept in is the approach of managing symptoms at a time. So I can see going back to maybe the early, maybe I've always been working in different ways. So I'm kind of baffled in a way by this management approach. But if we go back to the early years I had in my career, I could still understand it because what was available was very limited in terms of change work or thinking about change, thinking about the origin of these things, thinking about how trauma worked and how trauma is encoded. Those things have really only come online fully with the science base in the last decade or so in the fields of biology and neuroscience. So we know a lot more about how that works, which helps us to undo it if we're trained the right way and if we can. And so I suppose I'm a little sad about that there's so much emphasis in psychotherapy on managing, on I believe in the States, psychotherapists or some of you even prescribe medication, right? That's in your realm. In Ireland, it's that would be the realm of psychiatry to prescribe medication. And I think medication has a place, there's no doubt about it, for managing a crisis, for getting people through a difficult patch. But I think this, I feel, coming from where I've come from, there isn't enough emphasis on what we can actually change in a coaching setting, in a psychotherapy setting to improve people's quality of life. And there's too much emphasis, I feel, on the pharmaceuticals. And when you really think about it, they can bring you through a crisis and that's good. But do you really want to be on them lifelong if you can help it? Very few people, I believe, are in need of being on these drugs for life.
Yeah. Can you
When
talk?
when you change, when you rewire your coping strategies, then, you're in a different realm. You don't need. So I would often work with people on winding down medication they're on. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was like, can you talk about the importance of getting to the root cause versus that
Yeah.
management and why management is not a good long-term solution for some of these things that people experience and the traumas they have experienced? Can you talk about why it's so important to get to the root of that to actually be able to move forward?
Yeah, you've just asked me my favorite question of all time. So
Mhm.
I'm all about root causes.
Mhm.
And so coming back to attachment theory, so this is something I believe that it's the single most obvious, and it's at the same time the single most overlooked cause of all emotional trouble that people experience. So whether you're talking about anxiety, esteem issues, self-worth, lack of confidence, fears about certain things, imposter syndrome, maybe fear of public speaking, many, many, many of these things, in my experience, more often than not, go back to some kind of attachment issue. So, attachment issues, I think the term, probably your readers, your listeners rather, will be familiar with that term, attachment. It's all about parenting, how you are parented in very early life. And so, when you think about that, there's really a very close link to biology, that we are born with certain natural expectations as to what would be an optimal environment for our development in every way. And so what comes in with that is the need for safety. So babies want to be held, they want to be physically close to their caregivers. They need the caregivers to be consistent, to be there for them all the time, physically and emotionally, to look after their needs, feed them when they want to be fed, rather than according to a forced schedule, rather than being in a room on their own. Babies want to be close. And then when you get that little bit older, it comes to fostering independence, but in a way that's age appropriate. So you don't drop them in the deep end of the pool, but rather you encourage them to do the things they're ready for. And so all of these basic needs that we are born with, you can fall down on any of those in life. And, so it is called developmental trauma per se. That's the term for it in psychology. I've changed that around a little bit because I sort of feel like, I get very high functioning clients mostly. And, there are people who like to remember their childhood fondly, who maybe also like to have a good relationship with their parents where they can, or as good as they can, right? So when you bring in a charged term like trauma, it can get very difficult. And sure enough, there are traumatic experiences in that pool that I work on with clients. I'll share an example in a few minutes about one particular one that I encountered recently. But you're also looking at a lot of experiences that are very much everyday. They just have very much an everyday feel to them. So, for example, if you have a critical parent, critical father, maybe, that critical father is present every day. You can be sure there's something said or something done or communicated in other ways on a daily basis. And children will normalize the environment that they're in because they don't know any different. This feels very normal. And so the fact that dad is critical will feel very normal, even in their memory as an adult, it will feel very normal. And because we're also born with a huge love for the people that have put us into this world, it can get very difficult when we're naming it as trauma. And so I played with it a bit, and faulty childhood programming is the term that I now prefer because it communicates something was wrong somewhere. It can be minor, doesn't have to be a huge trauma. and we can change it. We can rewire it if we go about it the right way. So it hits all those notes.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's connected to a trauma story. So that can be on a spectrum. It can be anywhere from mild to severe. And so just to give a flavor, because we're talking on an abstract level here, but so this is something that I typically come across every now and then. And someone I worked with just today,
Mm-hmm.
who has, so she presents with anxiety, a lot of anxiety, not able to enjoy life. She's very high functioning, at the top of her career, but that's all she can do is just hold it together and keep that train on the tracks all day long, every day. There's nothing outside of that. There's no joy with it. And what we got to today was an early childhood story of sexual assault by someone very close to the family. And as a child, she decided to carry that burden by herself. She never shared it with anyone. She never asked for help or support because her intuition told her that it would be too problematic for the family, that it would lead to family breakdown or a huge catastrophe of some kind. She kept it to herself, and that became her lifelong coping strategy. So where attachment broke down, where the parents maybe were preoccupied with their own struggles, didn't pick up on the fact that their child became more and more withdrawn and just thought, she's grand, she's coping, she's doing well in school, everything's fine, brushed over it, maybe never even asked about it, maybe it never even occurred to them. And this is the outcome. You have an adult who's had a 40-something year struggle with reaching out to other people, connecting with other people, showing herself, talking about any issues that are meaningful to her, living a very solitary life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this would be an example on the more traumatic side of the faulty childhood programming spectrum. And then you also have just some examples where children simply copy what the parents are doing, because that's another thing we are born with, is to copy what's modeled for us by the parents. And if they find that their parents are very, very busy all the time, the children will learn that that's important in life, that's a good thing to do. So they will start doing the same in many cases, and they never even question why that is. And they never even question why they don't talk about things. When the parents don't have an emotional presence and don't introduce that kind of conversation, then it becomes very normal to grow up in an emotional desert. And often then children continue that lifelong. So those are that's the kind of spectrum of faulty childhood programming that I work with. And sometimes there's a bit of detective work in on the more subtle end of that spectrum to really pin it down, to really find out what are the causes here.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that spectrum, because I often find that many people who, struggle with that, like self-doubt, the anxiety, the perfectionism, often maybe can look back in their childhood and be like, I had a good childhood. I don't see anything that was, explicitly wrong, or, didn't experience anything that was traumatic. And then they can often put that blame on themselves. Well, there must be something wrong with me if I'm experiencing this, since I don't have anything that can explain this. But to understand that spectrum, that it didn't have to be something that was big. It could be just that you grew up maybe in an environment with parents that didn't express their emotions, and you didn't feel comfortable, and then maybe internalized it in a certain way. I think it's very important to see that it didn't have to be something huge to have some of these experiences as an adult, and that you can look back on maybe some of these patterns that you've lived with, and understand yourself in a different way, even though you don't have that big explanation for it, that there can be subtle ones that are there. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Absolutely. I believe most parents are actually really well-meaning. They want the best for their children. It's just that oftentimes they don't have any more to give.
Mhm.
They give you what they can give, but if they didn't have it themselves, if they didn't have the emotional support, if they didn't have, you know, they can't give it. They can't
Mhm.
give what they don't have. You have the abusive spectrum too, and let's not deny that that exists.
Mhm.
But I believe, luckily, that's the minority of parents who are outright abusive.
Mhm.
Most people just struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. And, kind of just going off that, I feel like that you've seen this trend, especially like the millennial generation saying like their parents, maybe were more like emotionally immature, weren't as available, didn't express the emotions. And it's like a generational thing that you're starting to see. So now you're seeing like the millennials that are more in tune with their emotions and then having this like discrepancy between how they were parented and what their experience is. How does that play a role where you start to maybe as an adult, you start to see yourself in a different way, you have a different experiences, you're more emotionally in tuned, but then still trying to have a dynamic with your parents and try to understand them. How does that play a role in all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So coming back to my origins, the German story is very much in my generation. So I was born in 1970, and it's still like my parents were born. My dad was born before the start of the Second World War. He was born in 1938. My mom was born in 1941. So when they were very young to talk attachment issues, you can imagine that their parents were very much preoccupied with survival, naked survival. There was nothing else.
Mhm.
And so they had a difficult start in life. And then after the war, you had a hunger period where there wasn't, I don't believe that my parents suffered hunger, but there would have been scarcity. So
Mhm.
there wasn't enough to go around, and there certainly wasn't plenty at any point to go around for about 10 years or so after the war. And so that's how they grew up. Those were their early years. And as a result, and then they ended up living in the dictatorship, which didn't help matters. And so you see a real contraction. They were never able to talk about emotions at all. They don't know themselves very well at all. And they're full of fear, and they continue to be full of fear, and they're full of anger. And a lot of that is true for much of that generation of the post-war children. And then you have my generation. So we grew up in a world of plenty. There was, even, in East Germany, I mean, it's often looked upon that we had a huge lack. We had enough, really. We had, there was always enough food. There may not have been a vast selection, but there was no lack of anything. And so we grew up with much more of an inward focus. We wanted to self-actualize. We wanted to follow our hearts in terms of choosing a career and not go the safe and secure route that our parents were suggesting. And so you have that definitely, like I understand that very intimately in Germany, this generational gap. And they're a generation, my parents, who would never talk about any of these kind of personal things, you know. So yeah, there's a tension there, absolutely. And it doesn't mean they're bad people, not at all. But that's just their way of being. And their choice, I suppose, has been that they don't want to change. They never went on a soul searching mission. That's a legitimate choice. So yeah, so it's been like that for a lot of people in my generation, that it feels like a real mismatch.
Mhm.
Yeah, and every generation pushes the boat out further, I suppose. I think my children will, in some ways, maybe it's not quite so stark, the contrast, I hope at least, but I'm sure they have their own criticisms of our parenting when they grow up. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And just, understanding, people are doing the best they can with whatever capacity that they have, as just as you shared
Yeah.
earlier. So helps with some of that forgiveness for maybe some of the things that weren't there as you're going through
Well,
it.
ideally, I mean, I also get the phase where people are really angry
Mm,
about what they didn't get, or maybe angry with the criticism that comes their way.
mm,
I get all that too. But
yeah.
ideally, in the end, there can be a resolution when the client is ready,
Mhm,
where they sort of make peace with their story and understand that actually it wasn't personal. You know, the criticism wasn't personal of them. That's how dad is with everyone, actually. That's how he is in the world. Or, you know, yeah, so they did their best, sort of thing. You know, that's where many people end up saying,
mhm,
actually, my parents did their best, they did the best they could.
mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing all that. I think it's really important to understand that and just, because if someone's going through that, to see how these discrepancies and what your experience is and what generational experiences and how this all melts together to see how just understand yourself more and some of these behaviors that you get into. You talked about attachment styles. Do you mind going deeper into that and some of these attachment styles, what that is, and how does that play a role in what we do, say, and think and behave today from where our attachment styles are?
Yeah, great question. So I'm not so, we can talk about attachment styles. I think the limits of attachment theory are in sort of leaving it at the attachment styles.
Mhm,
So there's three basic attachment styles. So we've got anxious, we've got avoidant, we've got disorganized, which has a bit of both. Um, and what it really means is that these are patterns that you adopt in relationship and they keep coming back. So you adopt them because they are what's modeled to you very early in life. And then you take them into adulthood, into your relationship. So the anxious person would be more on the clingy side, would feel a need for constant reassurance, would find it difficult maybe if the partner leaves. Those would be the anxiety triggers for them. And the avoidant person is so anxious about any kind of relationship that they withdraw and avoid relationship frequently. And maybe if they experienced a lot of conflict in their home growing up, they're going to be afraid of conflict and they're going to avoid it like the plague, as we say in German. And the disorganized person can go back and forth between the two.
mhm,
But in reality, the effects go much, much deeper. They go beyond just how you are in relationship. They go into things like self-worth. What are you able to claim for yourself in this life? Do you feel worthy of a good, secure home? Do you feel worthy of a good income? And if you don't feel worthy, then it's very difficult to get that for yourself. So somehow the outer world has a tendency to match what we hold inside. And things like confidence. So if you grew up with that critical father, very often you end up having imposter syndrome in adult life, which means you're constantly doubting yourself, you're second guessing everything, maybe going over and over your work projects rather than finishing them, rather than being able to use them to claim something better for yourself in your career. So the effects are really much, much deeper. They're really about the ability that we have to place ourselves well in life.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
although, like many of the clients I get would be very high functioning, there's often something missing. So it may be that desire to take the next step up in the career, and they are terrified of going for an interview. Or it may be the relationship side of things, where it just doesn't work and it's making them very, very unhappy. Or it may be the enjoyment side that's totally missing. And these effects go deep. They're really about how we can get the best from life.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing those. And then for someone who's listening to this and that's like, yes, like they're identifying, like that is me, like very much resonates with them. How do you start to get to those root causes so that you can start to move forward in your life and not feel like you're living the same patterns over and over again in different, maybe different situations in your life?
Yeah, so I mean, self-awareness helps hugely.
Hmm.
So it's a thing in America, a lot of people are in therapy. So if you can use your therapy to look for root causes rather than chat about what's going on in everyday life. So the
Hmm.
therapist very often will be led by the conversation the client steers. So if the client talks about, if you as a client choose to talk about the everyday and what's going on right now, okay, that's what you spend your time on. But if you spend your time on looking that little bit deeper and maybe begin to wonder where these patterns that you're experiencing, maybe in your friendships, in your relationships, where did they come from? Why are you the way you are? Where did you learn that? I think is a really useful question. I think that's a really good question to ask yourself because it's non-shaming and they are learning experiences. And it's always what we learn in early life. That's what we carry through into adulthood. So, like, where did you learn that? Where did that come from? And if you can ask that question and maybe do a bit of journaling about it as well, when you see a pattern, where did I learn that? Where did I pick up that pattern? And then something may click and you may go, it's because mom wasn't available. She was in hospital for maybe a whole year. And during that time, I had to do X. Maybe I had to step in to the housework, and then I couldn't receive anymore, but I had to start giving at that time. And then you get to know yourself more. You have much more choices, I think, when you develop that self-awareness first.
Hmm.
And then you can begin to really work your way out of that by trying out very gently, trying out different ways of being. Maybe if you realize like a huge thing for women also is people pleasing. Although I don't particularly like that term because it has a kind of a shaming element in it.
Hmm.
But it's really an attempt to, or rather not attempt to, but let's say it's the focus is on the focus is on other people over me. I think that's what people pleasing is.
Hmm.
So where did I learn that? So one thing I very often hear, this would be a frequent one, is growing up in an alcoholic household where the alcoholic was managed while they were a kid and they grew right into that. They learned how to manage the alcoholic
Hmm.
and how to walk on eggshells so that the alcoholic wouldn't become rageful, for example.
Hmm.
And then they take that into adulthood and maybe they start managing their boss in that way,
Hmm.
the volatile boss. And she becomes the best PA he ever had because she can read his mind.
Hmm.
Only she's left with no enjoyment at the end of it.
Hmm. Absolutely.
She's got nothing left for herself and she doesn't have the ability to set boundaries with him because that would change the entire nature of that relationship. So
Mhm.
she will answer the phone evenings, weekends, whatever, and she cannot draw the line.
Mhm. Yeah.
So when you develop self-awareness where these things came from, and then start to gently change the pattern, maybe not pick up that phone anymore after a certain hour, let it ring out, deal with it the next day, improve on boundaries, start saying no to certain things where you can within the organizational culture. Actually, great example. I had someone who worked works in an organization where the organizational culture is all nicey nicey. We must all be very reasonable and very nice with one another. But her experience has been that actually there's a lot of stuff happening underneath that, a lot of passive aggression. And she feels really subverted in her need to put boundaries in place. Because if she starts saying no, then people will say about her that she's unpleasant to be around, right? So I gave her a challenge. I said, see what other creative ways there are of drawing boundaries. So what she did, actually, this was about a workspace where she was being, the workspace was being encroached upon by someone else who was being very unreasonable. And so what my lady did in the end is she found a room, and it's a very large building. She found a room that nobody uses, kind of like a secret room that isn't very well known, not the typical go-to. And she uses that to withdraw to, so she can do her work undisturbed.
Mm-hmm.
Great way of setting a boundary. She didn't have to say no. She didn't have to confront anything. She's just making herself unavailable. She doesn't answer her phone during those times. She just gets down to it and does her work so she can leave right on time in the evening.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can do that creatively. It's not always about anger and confrontation. It's more about just respecting yourself, respecting your boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
and finding ways to do that. So, yeah, so my recipe would be definitely self-awareness. So a bit of journaling, talking to your therapist about the origins of where all this came from, these ways of being in the world, and then very gently starting to undo that and do it differently so that you can feel better. Because boundaries are a great cure for anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
I think very often for people pleasers, not liking the word, I used it again. Boundaries are often the answer. It's their inability to draw a boundary that has them constantly anxious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And just going off that example of, the people pleaser who, kind of walks on eggshells because they have an alcoholic parent, and then they kind of continue on with those patterns throughout their life. A lot of that comes from that fear that they have of like the repercussions if they don't go along with or appeasing other people. How do you start to create a sense of safety within yourself so that way you don't have to feel like you're just reacting to that fear response and then going off of that?
Well, again, that's a great question. So how I would work around that is, first of all, of course, what you can do even in talk therapy is make sense of that. So where did that fear come from? It doesn't belong in the present. Most of the time, it doesn't belong in the present. And if there is, maybe the volatile boss in the present, he deserves maybe 5% of that fear you're feeling, and the 95% belong in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So this sort of cognitive management can be one way of dealing with it.
Mm-hmm.
The way I work is I use psychosensory tools to downregulate that fear from the past. So we find the root cause, we downregulate that fear, and then you can often think about the present very differently.
Mm-hmm.
So your perception of a situation can change within the space of a few minutes, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the difference between just using talk tools and doing that sort of deeper processing work. So say, for example, coming back to the first example, I talked about the lady who discovered there was a very early sexual assault in her life. So her initial response was self-blame. She was angry with herself for never reaching out. Now you're looking at a child who was maybe 6 years of age, so way too young to have. Now my English is coming to its limits. Way too young to expect a child that age to deal with a situation like that. Never mind independently. She should never have experienced that.
Mm-hmm.
Yet her response was self-blame because she carried stuff all her life. And she was so angry with herself. So we worked with the anger. We downregulated the anger. And that took about 20 minutes. And then I invited her to look at the situation again. And I asked, what is she perceiving now when she thinks about this scenario? And then she was able to feel sad for that young girl she once was who had to go through that. So there was much, much more self-compassion. There was sadness. there was a nurturing, motherly feeling towards that inner child.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I would work to change things.
Yeah.
And then, of course, she has more choices once that feeling is down-regulated, you have choices to do things differently.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a
Then,
beautiful example. Thank you for sharing that. I just want to go a little bit further into this. As far as like down regulating, can you just give an example of what that looks like when you have that anger and then you can go to self-compassion? What do some of those down regulation techniques look like?
yeah, so like one of my favorite go-to tools is havening techniques.
Hmm.
And what we use is touch in havening techniques. So there's a lot of material come out about touch in biology over the last decade or so. It's very beneficial. Touch alone is very calming, and it also affects the brainwave environment in a certain way.
Hmm.
And you use touch in combination with certain techniques that are called distraction. So we would talk about the issue, we would talk about the root cause issue that's caused this fear, and thereby we activate it. And the client will feel that fear, and then we distract and do certain things in that distraction period, work with touch. So what we want to do is take the working memory offline so that the person can't ruminate. So this is actually, you asked me about what's not so good in talk therapy. This would be another of my pet peeves, is this insistence on feeling the painful feelings. So when you have a therapist who is process orientated, unfortunately, that's most of the time what they are trained to do, is to say to people, you have to feel the painful feelings. And actually, that's not such a good idea for most people, because what happens is it brings people out of their zone of tolerance. So it's a certain band of within which we can function well. So you can think, you can perceive your emotions, you're reasonably comfortable. Well, you go out of that very quickly when you have to feel overwhelming emotions, especially fear, especially anger, and they can bring you into dissociated territory. So that's why working with distractions is so beneficial, because we stop that process in its tracks. We activate, then we take the working memory offline and preoccupy them for the duration of that exercise with something else. And then we come out the other side, and clients report that the feeling is much less, or it's gone, whatever it's going to be. And then you make your decision how you continue the process after that, depending on the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
But it's surprisingly simple, Kelly. It doesn't have to be rocket science.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. And then do you notice carryover from when someone feels like that reaction is lessened, and then from the next time they maybe think of that event or whatever it is there carryover and where they're not experiencing that heightened response as much?
Well, that's the beautiful part of it, is
Mhm.
that every time you work on the issue, you will downregulate it further. And the
Mhm.
time will come where it doesn't bother them anymore. And it
Mhm.
will come sooner rather than later. So the work I do now in a 6-week program is the kind of work that I would have been taught would be long term, and that I would have for many years thought was long term. You
Mhm.
can do it much quicker if you know how to.
Mhm. It's amazing. And I think what a gift to so many people who maybe have been trying to work through things for maybe years and thinking that it is going to be going on forever, that you
It
can change
becomes
it
so
much
much part of you. So, yeah,
quicker.
and there's another piece of my story here that I can
Mhm.
share.
Mhm.
Um, and it's like you often don't know how much you're carrying, right? Because you're living with it
Mhm.
every day. And so, like 6 years ago, I would have said I'm in a really good place
Mhm.
in life. I still had the remnants of imposter syndrome. I didn't realize just how deep it went. And my first experience with psychosensory work brought me back to birth. It came very much through the body. And with it, there was a huge release of fear. So fear I didn't even know I was carrying. And it was absolutely massive. It was probably the biggest fear I've ever felt in my life for those few minutes. And then it was gone. And so much changed after that one session in this case. So it's not always in one session, I'm not a big promoter of the one session miracle. In my case, it was in one session, but it can be over a period of time. But the point is, you can do it in short-term work. So for me, what changed was the constant self-doubt that I had was gone. It was out the window. Within 9 months, I had changed my entire career, revamped my entire career. So, and I'm still harvesting the benefits from that 6 years later. And that's what it can be like. It's sort of like it's like the frog, the proverbial frog that's being put into a pot of cold water, and then you're putting it on the stove. And the frog doesn't realize that the situation is becoming unbearable until it's too late. And that's what happens, I think, in adulthood to a lot of people. They come into adulthood with a lot of baggage, emotional baggage from childhood, and they think, oh yeah, I can cope, I can do this, and forget about it, put it somewhere in a corner of the room, never look at it. And then it catches up with them, and they don't even realize how much they're carrying, and they don't realize how much their life and their career could change by just releasing that piece. So how much more they could get out of life. So that's something I'm really passionate about, is bringing people into their full potential. Because they don't, at this day and age, you don't have to put up with the limitations that childhood has put upon you. You can move beyond them.
Absolutely. I love that analogy too of the frog. It's so relatable because I think especially as high functioning women, you're used to just holding it together. Externally, everything looks great. And you're like, well, I'm getting everything done. I must be fine. And you kind of use that as your marker for what you are internally, but it's not true. And it's really all those things that do compile, and you don't even realize how much is there until you start excavating a lot of it. So I appreciate you sharing that. And I think that's such a relatable example for so many of us that just continue to live thinking that there's no better way, or this is just what I have to go through. And it doesn't have to be
Unfortunately,
that
like culture really supports that idea that what you have externally, that's you.
Yeah.
It's a reflection of
Right.
how well you're doing in life.
Yeah. 100%.
Unfortunately, those inner values of happiness and confidence and so on, we're not educated around those things in school. Should be.
Absolutely, 100%. And just like as you shared earlier, it's our external world is a reflection of our internal world. It's only when we dive deep that we realize that and start to understand that we have the capacity and the ability to create our life instead of just being almost a victim to what our circumstances are. So I absolutely love that. I feel like I could talk about this all day, Susanna, and I'm so
Yeah,
grateful
great
for everything.
conversation.
Yes, I'm so grateful for everything you shared. And for someone who's listening and wants to connect with you, where can they find you?
So, well, one little gift I have for your listeners, maybe those with anxiety who've been struggling with that maybe for quite a while, is my free guide, which when you claim that free guide also brings you into my emails. So there will be regular updates, and I can be contacted by responding to any one of those emails. I do offer one-to-one coaching. It's more, I'm working on the crossroads really these days between psychotherapy and coaching. I'm more, it's both. It's like deep work on your psyche and your emotions, but using a coaching approach. So I love doing it that way because it's very non-invasive. It very much lets people guide the way.
Beautiful. And I'll make sure everything is in the show notes too. So for anyone listening, definitely connect with
So
Susanna.
that's my reparenting program, where I play with the word repair
Mm-hmm.
and reparenting. So reparenting, again, is a concept of psychotherapy, as you will know, and it's about inner child work, and it can be endless. It can go on and on and on and on, and it's fairly unfocused. I don't like it because it's so unfocused, but nevertheless, inner child work naturally has to fit in with rewiring attachment issues. And so what I do is much, much more focused around it. It all has a purpose. And we also, or I also now understand there are certain things that need to be fixed. You don't need to relive your entire childhood or your unhappiness with Aunt Millie's birthday present when you were 10 years old. A lot of those things are entirely irrelevant, but there will be some key issues that we need to address. And then often it's like a house of cards falling down when you pull out a card at the bottom. And so I call it repair as in fix, REPAIRenting. Because when we get to those few crucial places, and they're different for everyone, and they're very individual, so it can only really be done one-to-one, a lot of that. Then the house of cards can collapse and everything can change. And so that's what I do in my one-to-one work. I'm also, I have a membership or a mastermind in the back of my mind also, but I'm not within the next 6 months anyway.
Very good. And I'll make sure that your guide is in there for anyone who's listening. And again, thank you so much for everything you shared today. Appreciate it. And, again, for everyone who's listening, thank you for tuning in to today's episode.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me, Kelly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Rewiring Health. I hope you found our conversation both enlightening and empowering. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to Rewiring Health so that you never miss an update. Also, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you could take a moment to rate and review the show, it would mean the world to me and help others discover the power that we all have within us to create change and create the life that we truly, truly desire. Thank you so much for spending your precious time with me and sharing the energy of the show.